London, 1978. The pubs were busy, the nights were cold, and the world kept turning as if nothing was wrong. But something was very wrong. In a modest flat at 195 Melrose Avenue, a man named Dennis Nilsen was preparing to do the unthinkable. He didn't look like a killer. He wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. He wore slacks, tucked in his shirts, and worked as a civil servant at the local job center. To neighbors, he was quiet, respectable, boring even. But behind his closed door, he was living with a secret so grotesque, so calculated, that even seasoned detectives would struggle to comprehend it. It began on December 30th, 1978. Nilsen met 14-year-old Stephen Holmes at a pub. Stephen had lied about his age. He was just a boy looking for warmth, safety, a little kindness. Instead, he found a killer. Nilsen invited him home, gave him food, alcohol, and when the boy fell asleep, Nilsen strangled him to death with a necktie. And then what? Panic, regret. No, Nilsen bathed the corpse, dressed it, and laid it next to him in bed. For days he spoke to the body like it was still alive. He watched TV beside it. He treated it like company. What kind of man does that? More importantly, how does a man do that and get away with it? Between 1978 and 1981, Nilsen would murder at least 8 more young men in that same flat. Some of them homeless, some struggling, some just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The newspapers would later call them drifters, forgotten, unimportant. But they weren't forgotten. They had names, they had families, and their only mistake was trusting the wrong man. Nilsen didn't just kill, he lingered with the dead, bathed them, dressed them, slept beside them, and when the bodies began to rot, he dismembered them and burned the remains in his garden. Neighbors noticed the smell, they complained, and still, nothing happened. How many cries for help went unanswered in those years? How many families searched for sons who had already been reduced to ash? In 1981, Nilsen moved to a new flat, 23 Cranley Gardens, a place with no garden, no way to burn what he was hiding. But the murders didn't stop. He adapted. He began cutting the bodies into smaller pieces and flushing them down the toilet. Yes, the toilet. For months the plumbing worked. The system that should have saved his victims, the infrastructure of a city, became part of his cover-up. Until finally, in February 1983, the pipes stopped cooperating. Tenants complained. A foul smell, strange blockages. On February 8th, a plumber named Michael Catron investigated. He pulled out lumps of flesh from the drains. Not sewage, not food waste, human flesh. The next morning, police arrived at Nilsen's flat. They asked him about the remains, and this is what he said. "It's a long story. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest." Was that guilt, or was it pride? Was this the moment he'd been waiting for? Not to be caught, but to be seen. Because make no mistake, Dennis Nilsen didn't confess because of conscience. He confessed because the story was no longer his to control. The crime scene at Cranley Gardens was unlike anything detectives had seen. Human remains in bags, bones in wardrobes, a skull in the oven. Nilsen had preserved some of the corpses in cooking pots. Others were stuffed under floorboards. For years he had been living with the dead, and not once did he try to stop. He gave the police a number, 15 lives taken, but he couldn't remember all their names, didn't even try, because for Nilsen, they weren't people. They were moments, objects, companions in a world he controlled completely. In October 1983, Dennis Nilsen stood trial at the Old Bailey. 6 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder. His defense, diminished responsibility, a troubled childhood, mental illness. Was that the truth, or just another lie? Psychiatrists concluded he was sane, fully aware. He knew what he was doing. He planned his crimes. He covered his tracks. He chose victims based on who would be missed the least. He wasn't insane. He was calculating. But somehow, even after the verdict, life imprisonment, Dennis Nilsen was still talked about like a tragic figure. The media called him lonely, misunderstood, tormented. Why? Why is it easier for us to sympathize with the killer than to name the victims? Why do we give more airtime to his thoughts than to the lives he stole? Dennis Nilsen died in prison on May 12, 2018. He died quietly. No cameras, no last words. He left behind journals, cold, clinical, grotesque. In them he compared death to art. He wrote about lighting candles next to corpses, about admiring them like trophies. Even in death, he wanted control of the narrative. But not this time. This is not a story about a sad man who broke. This is a story about a predator who was enabled, a man who killed again and again, while society looked away, a man who manipulated the public with words like regret and confession, while hiding behind a wall of lies. And for 5 whole years, those lies worked, until the pipe spoke the truth. Before there was Nilsen, before modern forensic databases and national manhunts, there was Melvin David Rees, a man who walked into America's mid-century optimism and turned it on its head. He dressed well, spoke with a soft voice, played smooth jazz in smoky clubs across Maryland and Virginia. Women liked him, men trusted him. He read poetry, quoted Nietzsche, talked about love like he knew what it meant. But beneath the surface, Rees was boiling with a darkness no one suspected. Not his bandmates, not his lovers, and definitely not the police. Because between 1957 and 1960, while America obsessed over rock and roll and the Cold War, Melvin David Rees quietly became one of the most twisted killers in US history. The first major clue came on June 27, 1957, when Margaret Harold, a 36-year-old woman, was driving through Prince George's County, Maryland, with her boyfriend, Army Sergeant Roy D. Hudson. They pulled off the road. A car followed. A stranger stepped out, calm, polite, until he wasn't. He aimed a .38 caliber pistol at them. He shot Margaret in the face, right there in front of her boyfriend, and then, with grotesque calculation, dragged her body into the woods and sexually assaulted her corpse. Sergeant Hudson survived, traumatized, but alive. He gave police a description, but no sketch, no surveillance, no DNA. In 1957, if you fled the scene clean, you disappeared. The killer vanished. 2 years passed. Then the unthinkable. January 11th, 1959, the Jackson family vanished. Carol Jackson, his wife Mildred, and their daughters Susan, 5, and Janet, 18 months, were heading home to their Fredericksburg, Virginia apartment after visiting family. They never arrived. The car was found abandoned in a field, empty, no sign of a struggle. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Over the following weeks, parts of the Jackson family began turning up in the worst ways imaginable. On March 4th, 1959, Carol's body was found, shot and stuffed into a ditch near Fredericksburg. On March 24th, 2 more horrifying discoveries. Mildred's body was uncovered in a shallow grave. Her skull had been crushed with a blunt object. Janet and Susan were buried next to her. Mildred had been raped. The children had been brutally killed. One of them buried alive. Can you imagine? A man kills your husband, your baby, then takes his time with you before disposing of your body like garbage. How does a man reach that level of cruelty and sleep afterward? This wasn't random. It was planned, methodical, cold-blooded. But even then, investigators didn't connect the Jackson murders to the 1957 killing of Margaret Harold. Why? Because Melvin David Rees didn't look like a monster. At the time, he was still out there, playing jazz clubs in Washington, D.C., drinking wine with strangers, talking philosophy, charming women, writing twisted fantasies in his journals about mutilation and necrophilia. He wasn't hiding in shadows, he was in plain sight. Then came the break, one you won't believe. In early 1960, an anonymous informant wrote to law enforcement, claiming Melvin David Rees was behind the Jackson family murders. He described Rees as a manipulative man, obsessed with death and domination. At first, investigators didn't take it seriously, an anonymous tip against a respected musician. But then the FBI searched Rees's home. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Horrenswerdechele, a hidden collection of violent pornography, handwritten essays detailing violent fantasies involving women and children, a detailed journal describing how to control victims, what they sound like when they scream, and how it feels to watch life leave their bodies. And most damning, Rees had written an account of the Jackson murders before the details were ever made public. He was arrested in May 1960, nearly a year and a half after the Jackson killings. But even in custody, Rees remained composed. He denied everything at first, smirked during questioning, lectured officers about the nature of evil and human freedom. He actually said, "The freedom to kill is the highest form of power." What kind of mind believes that? Is this philosophy or psychopathy dressed up in big words? In court, the evidence was overwhelming. The writings, the gun, the timeline. Rees was tied not only to the Jackson murders but also to the killing of Margaret Harold in 1957. That case had gone cold until now. He was convicted in 1961, sentenced to life in prison, but the damage was done. 5 lives confirmed, possibly more. Some investigators believe he killed others during his time on the jazz circuit, but we'll never know. Rees never confessed, never offered remorse. He died in prison in 1995, age 66. What makes Rees so terrifying isn't just the brutality, it's the disguise. He wasn't a drifter, he wasn't isolated, he was respected, connected, social. He used charm as a weapon. He was proof that the most dangerous killers don't always look like killers. They look like artists, intellectuals, neighbors. Just like Nilsen, Rees preyed on people's trust. So the real question is, how many more like him have slipped through the cracks just because they smiled in the right direction?